further ado, I'm going to jump right into your bio.
Okay.
So Jessica Wohl uses found remnants of domestic culture to explore social inequities that range from systematic racism to the demands of motherhood. Born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota, she graduated from the Kansas City Art Institute and received her MFA from the University of Georgia. Among other publications, her work has been featured in the T Magazine, New American Paintings, Vogue, Art News, and has been widely exhibited nationally and internationally. She has held residencies at the Vermont Studio Center, the Hambidge Center for the Art, and participated in an art residency in motherhood. She is currently an associate professor of art and chair of the Art History, and Visual Studies Department at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. So without further ado, here's Jessica. I'm gonna get on out of here.
Thank you so much, Holly, for that great introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to see some familiar faces on the participants list. It makes me feel great to know that y'all are here. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Holly and Dana Marie Lemmer and the jurors for the opportunity to participate in the show and for the invitation to come here and speak about my work with you today. So before I get too much into anything, I have to say that this is the witching hour at my house. So I have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old. And if there's some howling in the background, you'll know what's going on. Just to kind of say in terms of the Wiregrass Biennial that even as a Northerner, I've spent now 16 years in the South, or starting my 16th year in the South. And so I feel like I've kind of acclimated more and more to this part of the country. And I'm really happy to be a part of a show that spotlights work from this region. So my background is in drawing and painting, but I've executed most of my work in sewn or quilted form for the last about 8 years. And so what I'm going to do tonight is talk to you about my latest solo exhibition called Imagining Matriarchy, which the work from the biennial was originally made for. And then I'll talk also about a community engagement project that I made in conjunction with that show called the Free Patchwork Project. Oops. Sorry, get my slides here going. Okay, so this is the work that's currently in the Wiregrass Biennial, if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition. And I'm going to talk about this work in much more detail later, but I just thought I would start here since this is the piece that has allowed me to be here in the first place. And before I talk about that work, I want to share with you some of the driving forces that prompted me to create this work. This is a quote that's really resonated with me over the last number of years, and it's really at the heart of why I do what I do. So it says, "The work is not yours to complete, but neither are you free to desist from it." And while I don't consider myself a very religious person, I was raised with this belief that we're obligated to help make the world a better place. And as a member of like more than one invisible minority, I move through the world as a white woman, but many of the things that people can't see about my identity allow me to move through the world and experience situations that marginalize me and my family. So I feel like I'm in a good place where I can take advantage of opportunities. I can kind of talk about these things that I understand as work, and I can do that in my studio practice. So my way of feeling like I can take responsibility and kind of work on making the world a better place. And I also believe, as Louise Bourgeois does, that the act of sewing is a process of emotional repair. And so using sewing as a way of doing this work is really at the heart of what fuels me in the studio. And it gives me a sense of purpose in my studio practice. So I've turned to sewing as an outlet for slowing down, for peace, for connection, and as a way to center myself while the hustle and bustle of life swiftly flies by. And I know that other people do too, because I know that from this retreat, which you see a picture of here, one of our participants, Kathy, was with me at this retreat. So Kathy, I see you, and I know that you feel the same way. So like many of you, I imagine, I watched my mother and my grandmother sew, and those traditions were passed on to me. And while we often associate sewing with women's work, but I want to think really carefully about why that might be. And at its core, I suspect, is the notion that sewing is a way that people, and often women, fix things. It's immediate, it's analog, it's time consuming, but it's cheap and it's accessible. And it's a tool we've used as humans to clothe ourselves. So by sewing, we take care of it and we solve a problem. While it's often relegated to the realm of domesticity or to insignificant women's work, maybe even to something utilitarian, it is, I suspect, for many people, the act by which repair happens, both physically and emotionally, like Louise Bourgeois was saying. And so that all comes with me into the studio. So the works in Imagining Matriarchy command a presence. They take up space, they're large scale, they're loud, and they use a very gendered language of motifs such as pinks and blues and flowers to comprise a majority of their imagery. They envision a world that's powerful, commanding, and very visually feminine. So as one would move through the gallery, they might feel like maybe overwhelmed with these really intense colors, maybe energized. The experience is kind of designed to make the viewer feel like they're maybe invigorated or jolted awake, or brought back to life in a new reality where we may actually be experiencing a matriarchy. Maybe you feel like femininity has kind of exploded onto the gallery with these bright colors and soft fabrics, but it's not really intended to be a soft show. It's very like kind of unapologetically feminine. So this work came about really in the summer of 2019. If you can all mentally get back there, I was very exhausted by the election process. But I was really hopeful to see a number of women running for president. And then, of course, one by one, they dropped out of the race. And Elizabeth Warren was the last person to have dropped out of the race. And when she dropped out, I just was so surprised by this horribly heavy feeling of like, we aren't going to have a woman president. Like I always kind of knew it probably wouldn't work, but man, it just really hit me. And with that loss, I started to think about how this country would be different if it were run by a woman. And then I thought, what if it were always run by women? And actually, that's where the title of this quilt comes from, the Pink Party. It was like, maybe that's the new political party that we need in my head, you know. And when I do say this, I think it's important to say that I'm speaking in very broad generalizations. I know that there are many men who would conceive of the ideas that I'm talking about and be all on board. I know there's many women who wouldn't. And then I know there's lots of people who wouldn't identify as either. So I'm speaking with a very broad brush here. But when I was imagining this work, when I was imagining this concept, this imaginary matriarchy, I started to kind of go down the rabbit hole and think like, well, maybe we wouldn't even be here at all. Like maybe if it were always matriarchal, there wouldn't have been colonization and our country would be indigenous, and slavery in this country never would have happened, and maybe it would have never happened anywhere. And it really like sent me into a tailspin kind of. And all I could imagine was just how completely different it would be. And I started to think about what these differences could have been. And I couldn't come up with any imagery. Like I couldn't visualize it. It just seemed like an abstraction to me. So all of the works in the show, like with the exception of like the flowers on the fabric, everything is abstract because I came to the conclusion that I just can only try to communicate a feeling. Like what would this imaginary world feel like? I couldn't really imagine what it would look like. So that's why all of the works are abstractions. And in all of the quilts, the fabric comes from thrift stores and yard sales from all over the country. Sometimes it's like family members' old clothes and things like that. And the reason I'm so drawn to this as a material is because for me, that fabric carries this energetic charge from the many people who it once belonged to. And I really try to exploit this in my quilts as an artistic medium. So for me, that energy holds stories and histories of all the different people who live in it, and it gets embedded into the work. And so as a painter, I compose these quilts very much like through the composition of a painter. Like I'm thinking about the whole composition, but I can't get that kind of energy out of paint. And so I'm really excited by working with fabrics and making quilts for that particular reason. And by unifying these domestic materials into one form that provides warmth and comfort, the work becomes a metaphor for the ways in which people of our country, the former owners of these fabrics, over the years can come together in unity and like heal and do something like lovely and comforting the way that a quilt might. And there's actually research that shows that when people are feeling lonely or socially rejected, that they literally seek warmth. So the fact that these works are, functional blankets speaks to the notion that that warmth and comfort have a relationship with our social interactions. And, sitting beside one another under a blanket, for example, is a gesture that brings us closer. So even though many of my works are critical of our country and our leadership, our policies and our systems, they're also about optimism and closeness and community and hope and a kind of fantasy of like bringing everybody together. And so speaking of hope, these works were really greatly inspired by the book Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. And one phrase in particular really stuck out to me where she says, things that seem to happen suddenly arise from deep roots in the past or from long dormant seeds. And she uses this example of mushrooms in a forest and how there's this vast, expansive network of spores like lying dormant underground, invisible, in the dark, so to speak. And they're just waiting for this moment or this catalyst that will bring them all up to the surface at the same time. And so at the time that this show was made, that thought from this book made me feel like maybe I'm in the dark, but I'm not alone in my thinking. Like maybe I'm imagining this matriarchy, but maybe there's other people out there imagining it too. And I feel like, now I think in our post-Roe era, this maybe feels a little bit different. I think I'm seeing more of the network coming out, but I don't know if we've reached like a full tipping point yet. I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. But they really try to imagine this matriarchy, not in that state of dormancy, but in the moment of awakening, like in this bright moment where everything kind of comes to the surface and becomes visible. So in this work, A Woman's World, for example, it envisions a deep, complex, and chaotic space that at almost 8 feet wide really spans the viewer's field of vision when they stand in front of it. It creates a kind of space that one might imagine entering into. And so this feminine floral field, it's expansive, it's filled with blooms, and it's almost as if the floral background of this work is that moment where all of the flowers just open at the same time. It's punctured by these more masculine shapes, like these rectangular bars and sharp blue triangles that kind of pierce into this space, but they also float within it. And those components are really intended to exist in harmony together in a somewhat celebratory way. Like you can kind of see, it looks like kind of some invisible streamers kind of going through the top. So it's meant to still feel kind of bright and uplifting. So even though the blue shapes take up less space of the composition than the floral fabrics do, they really are the focal point of this work. And it reminds us that it's often the thing that exists in opposition to the majority or the thing that's different that carries some significant weight. I mean, like without these blue components, this quilt would be really boring. There would not be really anything much here to see. So what this means in terms of like my imagined matriarchy is that this space would not just be a land run by women, but that men and masculinity, like however it might be defined, would be an essential part of this society, like worthy of being spotlighted and celebrated. And I really suspect that those definitions would shift as well. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So with this work, The Pink Party, it also depicts this complicated space that one might imagine entering into. And while the curves at the top of the quilt function as celebratory streamers, the curves at the bottom, which were created from 2 tablecloths, they're almost breast-like, or maybe they even feel a little bit like butt cheeks. And they kind of are designed to like soften the tangle, like soften this lower edge, eliminate the sharp corners that we would normally expect to see there on a quilt. And it just maybe might bring the understanding that something that's complicated and nuanced doesn't always have to be like tense and frustrating and adversarial, that it might just mean that we're kind of softly embracing the fact that not everything is neat and clean all the time. And we can find joy and beauty and love in some of those areas, even where there's a kind of entanglement. So the Black curves in this work play a predominant role. They hang, again, from the top like party streamers, and they subtly situate Blackness as a source of celebration. And it kind of dances in tandem with these vertical pink bars that may imply something feminine. So this complex network that can't easily be untangled then like visualizes this kind of intersectionality where facets of Blackness and facets of femininity and womanhood are maybe not separate from one another, but are connected, depend on each other, coexist. And I like to think that that relationship might suggest a change in how gender and racial relations might exist in a matriarchal society. Here's an image for scale if you haven't had a chance to see it in person. It's about almost 8 feet wide. And then this is a detail of the quilting. If you look carefully, all of the Black stitches, they kind of radiate out from the center of the quilt like rays of the sun. And the center of the quilt is kind of toward the upper left corner of this image. And so that radiating outward from the center is another motif that really plays out in the series of work. So for example, in Black light, the dark here is also situated as a central point of origin. And then this composition kind of functions like that sun. And I'm trying to, situate darkness as the source of light. Maybe like the sun, it becomes the center of our universe, or the fixture that system revolves around, instead of something that's on the margins, or something that's, on the periphery, or something that's kind of less than in some way, according to the system. And so this would mark another paradigm shift that draws on themes from the book Hope in the Dark, where even just the title Black light refers to this phenomenon of, a kind of inversion of our traditional understanding. Like we typically don't think of Blackness as light or darkness as lightness. And so like, what does it mean if those things could somehow, be anew and be, poignant? Okay, so let's see. I'm going to go ahead with the next one. So as you know, these stitches, the quilting itself, for those of you who might have ever made a quilt, quilting is the thing that literally holds the quilt together. So it has, you need a quilt top, you need the backing, and then you need the batting, which is like the fluffy layer in between. And so the unification of these 3 layers is the quilting, and that is essential. That's what the quilt is defined by. So it's here where I use the Black thread and the pink thread as the quilting. That is what holds the quilt together. It's the Blackness, it's the pinkness that is like unifying and holding this quilt together. So this piece in particular really relies on our associations with the colors pink and blue, with masculinity and femininity. And of course, I understand, like in my matriarchal society, these associations may not even exist, but I use them here because I'm trying to speak a language that people will understand. And so I'm exploiting these color relationships intentionally. And in this case, we have a field of blue patterned patchwork. It's punctured by these rays of pink that kind of emanate again from this sun-like semicircle at the top of the quilt. And maybe think about like, almost like these pink rays are kind of peeking through a blue space, maybe like a sky or a more predominantly male kind of atmosphere. But they work in tandem. So again, they rely on the color that there's the least of, the pink, to be the focal point that draws your attention. And while the pink is solid, the blue has a combination of patterns that could arguably be understood as like masculine and feminine. So within this blue field, we have solids and plaids and polka dots and florals. And so what they're trying to do a little bit is blur the lines between these binaries of masculine and feminine that until recently kind of stood for the status quo. So I'm trying to introduce some imagery that can't quite be so pigeonholed. And that maybe from far away, an initial impact, we might appear as if these like pink and blues are kind of in opposition to one another. But then the more time you might spend, you might get a more nuanced look here that like there's actually a dynamic that's kind of playing out on the surface of the quilt and that plays out in real life where these things can't be so nailed down, that there's a wider understanding here. And you can see also here that I used both the pink and the blue, again, in the quilting, suggesting that a combination of those things, the masculine, the feminine, are the forces that unify. And here's a view of the two together. The bones of these are kind of the same. They're approximately the same size. They have the similar composition, but they don't match up like perfectly. Okay. And I want to keep talking a little bit more about this movement from the center out, this kind of sun-like motif. So here it starts to really feel a bit more explosive in my mind, I guess, that it's indicative of a moment of origin, perhaps, maybe like the Big Bang, or the moment that cells start to grow and multiply, where there's a spark of life or electricity or energy or some kind of like force of impact, almost like, in a comic book, there's like a pow, and then like everything radiates out from that. It's kind of how I'm thinking about these compositions. And so that's what was going on in my mind when I made this piece, Womb Universe. And this is the last piece that I finished in the show. I felt I needed something that was very maternal, like for me. So when the show opened in October of 2021, I had a 2-month-old son. So most of this show was made while I was pregnant. Maybe not most of it, but a lot of it was made while I was pregnant. And so I was thinking a lot about motherhood in relationship to matriarchy. And I just felt like I needed to make a piece that was womb-like. And so to me, this is like, it feels to me like the life that's growing in my body, like this, something cellular in the middle of a dark space with these flashes of pink kind of sparking out from the center. It's like the miracle of life, but it also feels like the sun, or again, like a star being born in the universe, or something maybe powerful or even spiritual or even halo-like. And when I constructed this quilt, I actually started in the center and moved out as well. So that motion is actually exemplified in the process, where I started with that little peach and orange kind of circles in the center, and then you just build out until the end. And so like Womb Universe, this piece was also constructed from the inside out. It's called Everything All at Once. And it, for me, was kind of like the chaos of life at home. It uses a traditional construction technique for a log cabin quilt, where pieces or logs are kind of sewn around a central square. And in its traditional form, the central square was red. And so that red represented the hearth of the home. And so here I've just made that red block like really big. And I've literally put little things inside the home kind of moving around. And I surrounded it with the red band as a nod to that tradition. And I kind of came to see these hourglass shapes as like little chaotic beings, like maybe members of a family, or like, I don't know, things are about to crash into each other that are charged with a kind of energy. I mean, I think that could be a metaphor for all kinds of things, depending on how we define home, like even in terms of our country, where everything's like a little bit off, but we all kind of share a certain kind of structure. And then honestly, the rest of the quilt was just really kind of put together more intuitively after that. So this work is called American Matriarchy Flag, and it's kind of like a flag that I imagine for this country that I have in my head. It still has 50 stars and it has some red stripes, but they're kind of patched and broken as a way of kind of visualizing and embracing those flaws and leading with a kind of honesty and transparency about imperfection. And And all the colors, I think, have kind of implications. Like, there's a lot of different colors here. So it's not just like red, white, and blue that may speak to a kind of diversity of the people that would be be making up this imaginary land in my head. And it still has a predominant like red and blue color palette, which I think we still associate with our nation and with political parties. It's kind of very intentionally balanced, so it doesn't really feel like one part of this flag is more important than any other. And really, it's the only quilt to date that I've ever hand pieced. And so what that means is that I didn't use a sewing machine on any of this. So every little diamond has been hand sewn in the quilt top. And I actually started this piece at the workshop that I showed you the picture of at the beginning of the talk. So I had no idea when I started this, but I kind of think of this as like my baby, because it actually took me 9 months, like to the day, to piece the quilt top together. And so for me, there's just something very maternal about this particular quilt, because it took as much time to generate as like it took my body to make my children. So there's just something like pretty profound in that. I don't know what it means, but I think it means something to me deep down. This is a detail of the quilt. Also, all the quilting in this piece is done with a fluorescent pink thread. So as I'm sure most of you know, stitching things by hand is not efficient. Like, it's not a productive way to spend one's time in general terms. It is slow and it is somewhat painful in the sense that you kind of prick your finger every time you make a stitch until you develop a callus. But I love hand quilting as a way of marking time. Like 9 months is held up just in the quilt top alone. And how can we visualize or quantify that? And I think that sewing is such a familiar act that even if you've never done it, you can still understand how long it might take to make a stitch. Stitching is also very portable and clean and quiet, and I can do it anywhere. I can pick it up and put it down in a matter of seconds. So this process, although significantly slower than using a sewing machine, actually allows me to do my studio work and spend time with my family at the same time. And, for anybody who's tried to do both, that that's almost impossible. So this process works that way. And I suspect it's one of the reasons why women have gravitated toward it for generations. It's a way that, for example, for me, that I can be productive, I can put energy toward my career, my family, and my personal wellness all at the same time. But I do want us to think very carefully about that for a moment. So one of the reasons that I'm drawn to this process is because it allows me to be doubly productive, or maybe like triply productive, to maximize how I spend my time, to multitask. Those are all good things in the systems that we currently exist within that were created by men. So Tricia Hersey of the NAP ministry breaks the systems of capitalism and white supremacy down with this very heavy hitting quote that really shook me. So it says, these systems have socialized us from birth to believe our worth is tied to how much we produce. And so, these 7 quilts in the show took me more than 2 years to complete. I needed to rely on 9 different people to care for my children during COVID so that I could do this work. It's basically, as any of you who make work know, it's like my entire being, translated into material form and hung on a wall. And in one of these systems, academia, that I, work in, it will be assessed by a body of my peers to determine if I'm worthy of a promotion to full professor, to make more money and earn more respect and gain seniority. And I love my job. I love my job. But haven't we all thought, like, is this really all that it's about? Like, juggling all these balls all the time, And more importantly, I was thinking, like, would a room full of women ever have created this system? And I think the answer is probably no. I think it's not. I suspect that women would have created more social systems, ones that embrace rest, health, caregiving, family, wellness, support, passions, connectivity, like the things we want to do when we're on vacation, And I think these things can also, like almost all of them, be found in a sewing circle, this kind of predominantly women-led social group that has existed, I suspect, since we were socialized and clothed. And so here it's where sewing and stitching and mending, these modes of traditionally women's work, are important tools to create a sense of connectivity and provide care and meet social needs. And I think these acts of sewing itself are just perfect. It's just a perfect metaphor for healing, for fixing the broken, for embodying a kind of trauma that has been healed. Much like a scar, a seam itself indicates a kind of history of trauma, like a cut in the fabric, a tear, a rip, and then it's been repaired and healed. And so like on every level, this process, I think, is just so harmonious with healing this world and making things better. So in that spirit, I started what's called the Free Patchwork Project, where remnants of the fabrics from the quilts in the show were turned into patches. And then those patches were used to mend the garments of community members. And so they would bring their worn garment to the gallery and they'd pick out a patch and leave it with their garment in a basket for me to mend for free as a gift to them. So it was a gesture of care. It was not a transaction. And it is very intimate to put your hands in the delicate spaces where other people's bodies go, knowing that this garment is going to be returned to them. So there was a very intense sense of connectivity that I felt through the garments with the people who had left me their garments to fix. And I think it embodies how in a matriarchal society, we may be less individualized and more communal, how caregiving would be valued, and how we may just value slowing down, taking our time, fixing things. We might not buy things as much, we may not be such consumers. And, it activates a part of our human condition. And I think it's also rooted in my own Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, which is this concept of performing acts of loving kindness and generosity to repair the world. So in this way, like little pieces of my quilts can go out into the world and live with others and help them have a shared experience. These were some pictures from the project. There was the little mending request that people would fill out. One of the pairs of pants on the right is one of the first mends I did. And then this picture in the middle, I was dropping my son off at daycare and noticed that one of the dads was wearing a pair of pants that I mended, and it was great. So that just like made my day. So there he is. But in closing, I just want to share that when this show came out, it was opening around the same time as Judy Chicago's retrospective at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And about a week after I finished my quilts for the show, I discovered this piece of hers in which she essentially asks the same questions that I asked myself. So if you can't read that, the big banner on the left says, "What if women ruled the world?" And then on the right, it says that. And then on the left, it says, "Would God be female? Would men and women be equal? Would both women and men be gentle?" And kind of goes on and on. And so this to me really proved Rebecca Solnit's point that there are actually many other people in the world thinking the same things as me, but that it was just kind of out of sight and in the darkness. And, through her retrospective, this was made visible to me, but it's really reassuring to know that there's other people out there thinking the same thing. Another thing that really hit me was the image of the banner that's all the way on the left that says, "Would God be female?" It has this explosive composition again. It's like the same compositional movement that I designed into my works. Here's Judy Chicago with a couple of her paintings. And so I just could not believe how similar they were. Like it almost gives me the chills. So like without knowing about each other's works, and I knew about her dinner party, of course, but, I had never seen these works before. What is it about this explosive composition that gets at the heart of something feminine? How did we both come to the conclusion in making what I think we would consider feminist work that an image should have like one central orb, a radial design, these soft rays moving out from the center? Like, how did these shapes and gestures come to be associated at any level with femininity? And even though Judy Chicago's works, I think, are more interested in investigating mortality and kind of environmental devastation than mine are, I think we're both generating images based on some kind of like physical or spiritual essence. So Margaret Atwood has a quote that reads, "Men are afraid that women will laugh at them, and women are afraid that men will kill them." And while this sounds very extreme, it makes me wonder if this explosive gesture of moving with speed from the inside out is one way to visualize or express like a fantasy of fighting back, or of getting out like a repressed, pent-up energy that women so often suppressed for fear of their safety, or losing their job, or ending their relationship, or appearing bossy, or angry, or any number of things that a woman, I think, so carefully navigates and calculates in a split second that can have serious and sometimes life-altering consequences. It's kind of like a silent scream made visible, is I guess how I think about it. Or maybe it's just an aura, like a womanly glow, like what they say you look like when you're pregnant or in love. Or maybe it's just a way to visualize the life-giving energy that our bodies have, that spark of life when cells reproduce to perpetuate our species. Or maybe it's a nipple, how we feed our young. Maybe it's an eye, something that sees, that's omniscient. Or maybe it's the universe, or a solar system, or a flower that's just burst open. And, you know, to our oldest ancestors, flowers indicated something that would turn into fruit. So it even is a way of, you know, being associated with sustenance. So for me, for all of this is embedded in these works. But it also seems to get at something much larger that's at the core of a woman's experience. And so this is something I'd like us to see, you know, to make visible, so that perhaps we can understand what might be at stake if we don't start to shift our paradigms, if we don't start to kind of rise up out of the ground, out of the darkness, so we can see each other. And that once we can then envision something, we can maybe take some steps to enact it. So that is all I have. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Wonderful. I enjoyed every minute of that. I love the pink party even more now than I did before. So everyone, if you have any questions for Jessica, you can either open up your Q&A box or go into the chat and ask away. I will moderate those questions. I'm going to open up the chat just in case.
Let me just put something else on the screen that's prettier to look at than my name.
I concur. Robin said, "This work is gorgeous and inspiring. I would like to join your pink party." Me too. Me too. And then let's see. So I do, while people are maybe thinking of their questions, I do have one that I was thinking of while you were talking. But so I always am very interested in how artists found themselves to be artists, because I mean, people might have been creative as children, but like so at what point did you know, like, I'm going to be an artist and this is what I'm going to do with my life and I'm going to study this in school? And was that just something you always knew, or did you fall into the role?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the best answer to that is that when I was in high school and I was starting to look at colleges, and colleges were saying, like, you need to be involved in all these other things to like get your college resume, you know, like looking good. Like, I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted to be in the art room, like after school. And I was really upset that I couldn't get credit for that, you know, like didn't count for anything.
Yeah.
And so when I looked at schools, it really was, there just wasn't anything else I wanted to do as much as that. And so it was kind of a no-brainer for me to go to art school. So that's what I did. And I think I have a hard time saying, like, did you always know you wanted to be an artist? Because I think I've started to use that word with more and more care and esteem. And I think I'm maybe just barely getting there now. I think the way that I see the world and the kind of compulsion to work with my hands, and like the inability to be okay after a period of time if I don't do something with my hands, is something that maybe makes me feel more validated as an artist. But I think for me, it was more about like just nothing I wasn't really interested in doing the other things that people tend to be interested in doing when they go to college. Like I just wanted to make artwork. So I think that's just kind of how I don't know. Did I know? It was more like I didn't know. Like there was nothing else I wanted to do.
You're like, this just fits. And
yeah.
So what did your parents, were they like always supportive, or were they just kind of like, what?
No, my parents were supportive. Thank goodness, they were very supportive. Yeah,
Good.
They were very supportive. Yeah.
So, which it kind of brings me to my next question. So how did your childhood affect your practice now? I mean, because I'm looking and I'm like, you must have had just like a really strong matriarchal circle, or maybe you were looking for that.
Well, that's I haven't really thought. So I was very close with my grandmothers, both of whom did a lot of work with their hands. One of my grandmothers, needlepoint, quilt, crochet. My other grandmother did a lot with food. She actually was always in the kitchen. And my mother did a lot with sewing, lots of needlepoint, lots of crochet. So I always had it around. Like I remember this like very fondly, like the sound of my mother's sewing box, like going into her nightstand drawer and like clicking it around. Like I just like love that sound. But one thing I would say that's probably not visible from my talk, it's not obvious. Like I don't have quilts in my family. It's just not something that is a tradition that I had, but my parents were divorced, or still are, but growing up from the time I was 2, they were divorced. So I was always in different places. I had different rules in different places. I had different personas in different places. And like one place I was the oldest and one place I was the youngest. And so there were all these changes. And I think for me, I became most comfortable when something was like always not complete. I know that might sound really weird to say, but like, I was always sort of different in some way from every environment that I was in. And I think that how that has come out in my studio practice, it looks really harmonious and really like well crafted in this show because I'm only talking about one show. But like, if you look in my website, like I still draw, I embroider on photographs, and I make collages, and like I can paint figuratively like pretty well. And I do all these different things. And like, I'm just not the artist that has that one thing that they do that they're known for. It's just not me. Like, I just can't commit. I just need to kind of be a chameleon. So I would say that maybe that's the biggest way that my childhood has affected my studio practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we can wait on, let me look in this Q&A and see, or the chat. All right, if anyone has any questions, now is the time. There's a Q&A box or a chat box at the bottom, and you can just type them in. No pressure. And then while we're waiting a little more, one thing that I was always a tomboy, which I don't like that term anymore, growing up. So I think because I always associated the color pink with being a girl, that I just never liked that color. I've never like worn it really or used it in my house. And until recently, I'm like really drawn to the color pink. Anyway, that's more of an observation, but I kind of like thinking about that quilt, about the pink party. I'm like, I love that, but it's so different because normally I wouldn't be drawn to something pink. So sometimes I wonder if that is the patriarchy. Like at some point in my life, why did I hate something that was representative of being feminine?
Yeah, I mean, I would think deep down somewhere, almost everything that we have thoughts about in that way is rooted in these systems. I mean, when I was saying that I was getting really overwhelmed thinking about like what our world would be like not just if we had like female leadership now, but like what if from the beginning of time, this is how it was. You just can't even, like, it gets so intense because you just like everything we know is structured through this, like, I mean, that quote about the productivity, it just nailed me, because like, I remember going to art school and being like, my professor would come in at like 2 a.m. on a Saturday to see who was there. And you get like bonus, like, oh, I go, yeah. Like I was there, like, luckily I'm working that hard. Yay. And I just like, I would say until this moment, like 2019, when I really had that like epiphany, I expected it of my students too. I mean, Brooke is here. She can attest to that, like I expected there to be work, like y'all should be working all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't push that anymore. Like, I just can't sign on to that, like I just can't do it. I've actually like put something in my syllabus now that says like, we are all entitled to rest. Like, I'm not going to check my email all the time. I don't think you should check your email all the time. Like, we need to be responsible.
Right.
But like, you have more in your life than my class, and I have more in my life than this class. Right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But that is just that mindset of hard work. Hard work is what gets you things. And I think to a certain extent it does, right? Like, I couldn't make these quilts without thousands of hours in the studio, but that our worth is placed on that productivity is very problematic for me now that I can see it.
Yeah. 2020 definitely shifted our consciousness in a lot of ways. And I think that everyone slowed down, and we were gardening and we were spending time with our people. And I know a lot of people could not handle that, that slowness. But I trained for it because, as I said, I lived in North Dakota for almost 5 years.
Right.
I was like, this is
right.
I'm used to that. But anyway, well, she said yes, it did answer her question.
Oh, good.
Well, I'm feeling very empowered now. I love your work even more. This has been a really fun artist talk for me. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh,
I hope everyone else has too. And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Jessica, thank you so much for giving us time, on a busy Thursday evening.
This is great. Thank you so much. It's nice to see friendly faces virtually, even though I can't see your face. So.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your night.
Yeah. Thank you. Y'all too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.